Hello, we are going to go ahead and read Chapter 3 of Wisconsin's First People. The first page at the bottom, you can see that there's a timeline starting 10,000 BC. And then the next page, the timeline continues. And you see some of those words that we looked at in Wisconsin archaeology: Mississippian, Oneota, woodland traditions. So those are all words that we're familiar with and we know about their cultures. As we are reading, I want you to think like a historian. How did the earliest people in Wisconsin live? How did the lives of Wisconsin Indians change as the climate warmed? Which changes in the lives of Wisconsin Indians were so large that they were turning points? What kind of things did Wisconsin Indians do thousands of years ago that we still do today? Exploring Native peoples' history and traditions. In this chapter, you will read about different groups of Indians who lived in Wisconsin thousands of years ago. As the climate warmed up, plants and animals' life changed. The way people lived changed too. You'll recognize these changes as you read through the chapter, and a lot of this will be a review from our Wisconsin archaeology. Who are Wisconsin's first people? Native people have lived on the Northern American continent for thousands and thousands of years. Many different groups of Native people lived in the area that we now know as Wisconsin. Native people are also known as the first people. For example, the Menominee and the Ho-Chunk people are two of the Indian nations in Wisconsin today. They tell stories of their ancestors who lived here thousands of years ago. Other Indian nations lived in Wisconsin today arrived here much later. The earliest Wisconsin Indians adapted or changed their way of living as the land and weather changed. This adaptation happened very slowly. You can tell by looking at the timeline on page 38 and 39. You'll learn just how people's homes, food, hunting, and way of living adapted to the changes in the land and weather. Indian nations in the state today continue to adapt, yet they still honor the stories and memories of their ancestors. Each Indian nation has its own language, history, and traditions. Each nation also has its own creation story that tells the tribe's beginning. Tribal elders have passed down the nation's history and culture in stories, art, and songs to the next generation. How did the Menominee people come into being? A Menominee sacred legend tells of the tribe's beginning along the shores of the Menominee River. The bear traveled along the river and found that he was alone. He called out and said, "Eagle, come down and be my brother." The two brothers talked about who they would call next to become their brothers, and they saw a beaver approaching. The beaver requested to be taken into the clan of the Thunderers, but because she was a woman, instead, she was adopted as the younger brother of the bear. As they continued, the bear also adopted the wolf, the crane, and the moose as brothers. One day, the bear told the wolf, crane, moose, and eagle to go on separate journeys. Through their travels, each brother met other animals and birds, and each brother adopted some of them as younger brothers. Today, the descendants of these first Menominee people live along the banks of the Wolf River on the Menominee Indian Reservation. The Menominee have a complicated structure of clans or groups which are known by spirits of the air, earth, or water, or by certain animals. There is a council of elders for important affairs. The 5 main clans are known as the Bear, the Thunderers, eagles, the Crane, the Wolf, and the Moose. The bottom picture, the black and white picture, the caption says, "This is a Menominee sculptor, James Frechette, at work. As a child, he listened to tribal elders tell stories of Menominee traditions. As an adult, he carved the light-colored bear to the right. You can see the Menominee clan story on display at the University of Wisconsin Stevens Point Library." Ways to discover the long ago past. This will definitely sound familiar. How do we know about people who lived long ago? To study the past, you need the stuff of the past. Historians study newspapers, diaries, buildings, and other things from the past. These documents and artifacts help us learn what really happened long ago. Another way we learn about people of the past is through oral tradition. Tribal stories like the Menominee legend you just read were passed down from one person to another without ever being written. They connect people to this land. Archaeology is another way to learn about the long ago past. Archaeology is the study of people who lived long ago based on the things they left behind. Almost none of the objects and buildings from the long ago past still exist, and they did when they were made, as they did when they were made. How do archaeologists find evidence of the way people lived? Archaeologists study the places people used to live and the things they left behind. Places are called sites. Sites may contain old fire rings used for cooking or a pit where food was stored. Artifacts are the things left behind by people of the past. Artifacts could be broken pottery, bones, weapons, or tools. Archaeologists use these artifacts as clues to discover how people lived during certain times in the past. A site might be named for its location or for who owns the land. If a site was found in the Dells, for example, it might be called the Dells site, or maybe the Waterslide site. The picture on the left here says, the deeper you dig, the older the artifacts you find. Can you identify any of the oldest objects in the garbage dump exhibit? Looks like there's a glass bottle, maybe part of a license plate. How do archaeologists study a site? Once archaeologists discover a site, they may decide to excavate or dig portions of it. Archaeologists have to carefully keep track of exactly where they find all artifacts and clues as they dig. The work you see on the page took place at the Apple Branch site in Lafayette County in the western uplands. The evidence archaeologists found showed them that Indians lived at Apple Branch between 400 AD and 600 AD. Archaeologists work to preserve the sites they find. They do this by carefully mapping and taking notes about the clues they find at each site. Many animals, many objects like clothing and food rot before they are found. It's like trying to solve a giant jigsaw puzzle that's missing pieces with no pictures to help. The top picture, the caption says, as archaeologists sift dirt through a screen, they find small artifacts that they otherwise might not see. When they study this evidence later, they will understand more about the way people lived at a site like Apple Branch. These looks like artifacts that they found. Here's the compass, indicates direction. Archaeologists used trowels to carefully scrape dirt. And archaeologists found these two spear points at Apple Branch. They are both the actual size, which is pretty cool. Mammoths, mastodons, and earliest people. What can we learn from mammoth bones? In 1964, Frank Schaefer needed a ditch dug on his farm in Kenosha. During the digging, a worker hit something so hard that it knocked him from the tractor. Nearly 30 years later, the Schaefer mammoth tusk discovered that day would help change the world, what the world knew about the first people of Wisconsin. Mammoths and mastodons became extinct not long after people arrived here in Wisconsin. These animals were hunted for food and clothing. Bones and teeth may have been used to make tools or weapons. Before the Schaefer find, scientists thought that people had been living in Wisconsin for over 11,000 years. They knew this because they had found proof on bones found at other places in Wisconsin. What kind of proof? Cut and scrape marks on the bones showed where the ancient people had killed the butchered animals. When scientists tested the tusks and other bones found at the Schaefer site, They discovered the remains were over 14,000 years old. This changed the way archaeologists and other scientists thought about the ancient world. At the top, there's the skeleton of the mastodon. The mammoth. The Shaver mammoth wasn't the only mammoth discovered in Kenosha. While archaeologists were working on the Shaver site in 1991, Frank's neighbor, John Hebior, told the team about a bone he had found on his farm about the same time. In 1992, scientists went back to work on John's field. The Hebior mammoth is the most complete mammoth skeleton ever found. You can see it today at the Kenosha Public Museum. Mastodons and mammoths are relatives of today's elephants. By studying their skeletons, scientists can tell us that the adults were from 8 to 10 feet tall at the shoulder. They were close to 16 feet long, weighed about 9 tons, and were covered with long fur. Who were the Paleo people? Archaeologists call the earliest people in Wisconsin Paleo people. They were the ancestors of Native people who live in Wisconsin and other places today. Paleo Indians lived here as hunters and gatherers between 12,000 and 6,500 BC. That's over 14,000 years ago. Artifacts like this spear point on this page have been found at about 750 sites in our state. Studying the points has helped us learn about the Paleo Indians were skilled hunters and craftspeople. The climate was much colder when Paleo Indians lived here. They traveled far and wide to find food to gather and game to hunt. They lived in small family groups most of the time. When these groups decided to join together, they were called bands and later tribes. Paleo Indians traveled on foot to hunt animals such as deer, elk, mammoths, and mastodons. They also gathered nuts and berries in the forest. And we know that they made boats out of animal skins and other material to cross rivers and lakes. They lived so long ago that only a few of the things they made had survived. But studying those things help us understand how Paleo Indians lived. At the top here, there's a map. The caption says, "This map shows some paleo sites that archaeologists have found in Wisconsin." The spear, archaeologists found this paleo spear point in Dunn County. Glaciers were still shrinking north when this point was made. In this bottom right picture, people in the Paleo era often made their homes in a rock shelter like this one. And our final spear point, points like this one pictured here are known as Gainey points. About 100 years ago, two boys from Boaz, Wisconsin, found some mastodon bones and two spear points. The bones the boys found were accidentally combined with different mastodon bones found in Anderson Mills over 30 miles away. The combined skeleton is still on display in the Geology Museum on the University of Wisconsin-Madison campus. Pretty close. Inventions for a new age, the archaic tradition. How was life different for the archaic Indians? About 9,000 years ago, the climate in Wisconsin became much warmer and drier. It was even warmer and drier than it is today. Oak trees began to replace pine forests in the southern part of the state. Mammoths and mastodons disappeared forever. Deer and smaller animals increased in number in the new oak forests. Indian communities adapted to this new environment. Groups of Indians began to live in one place for longer periods of time. They hunted and gathered new foods. They made new tools for new tasks. Archaeologists use the term archaic to describe these different groups of people and their new tools. More food helped archaic people survive, so their communities grew larger. Together, such changes in ways of living mark a turning point in history. For the next 6,000 years, Native communities continued to feed, educate, and protect themselves. Distinct groups of archaic Indians lived in different areas of Wisconsin. They were not related to each other, but they survived by using many of the same tools and living in the same way. In 1997, archaeologists from the Wisconsin Historical Society excavated a site in Crawford County. They named it the Crow Hollow site. You can see the picture, the map on the left, where the little triangle is where the site is. Archaic Indians lived there 5,000 years ago. The clues and artifacts found at Crow Hollow show us how the Archaic Indians lived. The bottom left here, in warmer weather, people at Crow Hollow needed less shelter. They probably lived in wigwams like this one. Wigwams are made of branches, hides, and bark. On the right here, it says when archaeologists excavate, they find animal bones. This evidence tells us that archaic people hunted animals such as deer, elk, rabbit, and birds. They also fished and gathered clams from the water. They killed or caught what they needed. There might be another sentence down there, but it's cut off from my page. How did archaic people live? Families and friends formed communities at different places at different times of the year. They knew when food resources would be most abundant at certain places. They moved from one campsite to another to be near the best food resources all year round. Archaic communities moved to sheltered areas when the weather turned cold. Sometimes they used rock shelters. At other times, they built warm houses at the bottom of tall ridges away from the wind. During summer, the archaic Indians moved near wetland areas. Wetlands gave them plenty of fish to catch and wild rice and other plants to gather. The Indians dried and stored the food that they didn't eat right away. In the summer and early fall, archaic people lived at sites like Crow Hollow. Crow Hollow is in a hilly area with plenty of deer and other game. Crow Hollow also has nut trees like hickory, oak, and walnut, and the site is near a creek with fish and good drinking water. On the right here, we've got some captions. Archaic tools from Crow Hollow. Why does this point look different from the paleo point on page 45? Think about how you might attach a stone point to a wood or bone. Archaic Indians began making many different stone tools to help them survive. This tool is a scraper. It was used to clean meat off a hide. It could also be used for woodworking. People at Crow Hollow split open and roasted nuts. Then they used the nut shells as fuel for the fire. Archaeologists store them in a bottle to protect them. People of the woodland, new ways of living. Who were the people of the woodland tradition? Archaic Indians did not disappear or move away. They changed the way they lived and the way they viewed the world. Indian people had changed enough by 800 BC that archaeologists gave them a different name. We refer to them as woodland Indians, which we recognize that name. Woodland ways of living were different from those of archaic Indians in three important ways. First, woodland people started to cultivate crops. Cultivate means to grow and harvest. Second, woodland people began to make pottery. And third, they also built special burial mounds. These changes did not happen everywhere or all at once. One group of woodland Indians made their home in the rich wetlands in the eastern ridges and lowlands. This is just northwest of where the city of Madison would later be built. Today, the location of this community is known as the Murphy Site. All the clues and artifacts you see on these pages are from the Murphy Site. They tell us about the way people lived during the woodland era. You can see this triangle is where the Murphy Site is. The style of house at the Murphy Site is known as a keyhole house because it had a long tunnel-like entrance to keep out the winter's chill. Archaeologists uncovered the remains of a small keyhole-shaped house like this one at the Murphy Site. The photograph was taken from above. It shows you how the shape of the house appeared on the ground. What was life like for the woodland Indians? Woodland families spent their time hunting, gathering, and cultivating. They planted gardens of corn, squash, and other plants along the edge of wetlands. Families harvested their gardens in the late summer. Then they celebrated with community dances and feasts. In the fall, woodland families gathered wood for fuel and nuts from hickory, oak, and walnut trees. They gathered wild rice from the wetlands. Adults developed new tools for hunting. Their bows and arrows replaced atlatl and darts. Older children probably helped make these tools. Woodland families still hunted for food, fur, and hides. They built storehouses above ground and dug storage pits to keep the food safe. Woodland people were the first to make pottery. Pottery came in handy for preparing, cooking, and storing food. When people died, some woodland Indians built special mounds for burying them. The mounds were often built in the shape of animals. These were called effigy mounds. Woodland Indians held ceremonies when they buried their dead. Many people had to cooperate to build effigy mounds. Woodland Indians still moved from season to season, but they spent more time at places like the Murphy site. They found many resources. They also grew gardens that helped them survive. The top right, this piece of pottery was all that survived from a cooking and storage pot. Using pots made cooking food, especially corn, easier for woodland people. This is how the complete pot would have looked. Here's a person. The atlatl allowed hunters to throw a dart further than they could have with their hands alone. And finally, this photo shows effigy mounds at a place called Franks Hill in Richland County. A man named Frank Shadewald bought the land after the mounds were discovered and helped to restore them. The mysterious Mississippian tradition. What makes the Mississippians mysterious? Woodland people lived all over what is now Wisconsin for 2,400 years. About 1000 AD, different groups of people began living in the southern part of the area. These groups had their own traditions. They brought these new ideas to Wisconsin. Their settling in Wisconsin marked another turning point. One of these new groups built many of their villages along the Mississippi River. Archaeologists call them the Mississippians. The Mississippians lived very differently from their woodland neighbors. Only a few Mississippian sites have been found in Wisconsin. Aztalan is the largest of these. Aztalan is on the west bank of the Crawfish River. You can see a picture where it is here on the map. It is near Lake Mills in Jefferson County in the eastern ridges and lowlands. For just about 200 years, the Mississippians lived in Aztalan. At the time, it was the largest city in what is now Wisconsin. Many people lived there year-round. No one knows why Mississippians came into Wisconsin. No one knows why they later disappeared. People from Cahokia, is what is now southern Illinois, moved to Wisconsin. People from Wisconsin also traded with Cahokians and brought new ideas north. Like Cahokia, Aztalan was located on a river and surrounded by walls. People would have traveled back and forth between Aztalan and Cahokia by paddling their canoes on rivers that connected the two sites. Maybe Aztalan and Cahokia were surrounded by walls to protect those living there from their neighbors. What do you think happened to the Mississippians? At the bottom, there are tools, Mississippian tools from Aztalan. This copper tool is an awl for sewing animal skins. These 2 points are actual size. Mississippians attached them to arrows rather than spears. And this clamshell could be attached to a bone or wooden handle. Then it became a garden tool used in cultivating crops. What was life like at Aztalan? People lived at Aztalan all year round, so they needed food to survive the long winters. They depended even more on the crops they grew and stored, like corn and squash. They were good farmers. Mississippians also caught fish and hunted animals like deer. Just like cities today, Aztalan had to be very well organized to keep things running smoothly. People had special skills and jobs to do. For example, there were farmers, hunters, potters, and builders. Mississippians built at least 4 large flat-topped temple mounds at Aztalan. A few powerful leaders may have lived in houses on top of the mounds. These leaders also conducted ceremonies on the temple mounds. At the top it says today, You can visit this temple mound built at Aztalan. Perhaps dance ceremonies like the one pictured here took place on top of this mound. This photograph shows an Aztalan house recreated at the Wisconsin Historical Museum in Madison. You can actually walk into it. Mississippians at Aztalan added ground up clamshells to the clay to make their pottery stronger. That's cool. Early Wisconsin farmers, the Oneota tradition. Who were the early Wisconsin farmers? Other groups of Indians began living in Wisconsin a little later. They lived in a different way than either the woodland or the Mississippian people. Archaeologists named them the Oneota after the Oneota River Valley in Iowa. The Oneota were the ancestors of the Ho-Chunk and other Indian nations. Archaeologists have found more Oneota sites than Mississippian sites in Wisconsin. The Oneota lived in large villages in the southern part of our state. They often built the villages near large waterways like the Mississippi River and Lake Michigan. They also lived along smaller rivers. The Dombrowski site along the Wapaka River is one of these. At least some of the people lived in the site all year, just like the Mississippians did at Aztalan. All the artifacts and clues on these 2 pages were found at the Dombrowski site. Think like an archaeologist. See how many differences you can find between the Oneota and the other Indian groups. This picture, one group of Oneota people lived along the Wapaka River in Portage County in the Central Plain. Archaeologists call their village the Dombrowski site. The Oneota people were excellent farmers. They cultivated corn, beans, and squash, 3 vegetables that many Native people of the Americas later called the 3 sisters. The 3 sisters grew well together and made for a very well-balanced diet. Again, that's corn, beans, squash. Oneota tools from the Dombrowski site. This shaped piece of turtle shell was once part of a bowl. Resources from the marsh, fish, shellfish, and turtle were used by the Oneota both for food and as materials to make useful objects. Oneota hunters, like those at Dombrowski, attached points like this one to arrows. This point is the actual size. Oh, it's so small. What was life like for the Oneota? The Oneota houses were different from those of the earlier Indian groups. Some houses at Dombrowski were just large enough for one family. These houses didn't have long, low entrances like those at the Murphy site. The Oneota people also built long houses. Grandparents and aunts and uncles and other family members could have lived there together sometimes. Other families lived in smaller groups. People at Dombrowski ate a wide variety of foods. They planted crops like the 3 sisters, corn, beans, and squash. They caught turtles, sturgeon, catfish, and perch in the river. People also gathered wild rice in the wetlands. People hunted animals like deer and bobcats in the nearby woods. No wonder the Oneota spent more of the year at the site on the Wapaka River. Up here, you can see the side of the house has been cut away to show how people lived in a longhouse where several families lived under one roof. Can you see how the walls were layered with grass between the posts? How interesting. At the top, archaeologists discovered this longhouse at Dombrowski by carefully excavating a large area and recording patterns of post holes. This line of post holes was all that was left of a wall of the longhouse. The holes you see in this photo would have held posts like those in the drawings on the left. And at the bottom, the Oneota made pottery with different patterns than the Mississippian and woodland people used. In some ways, however, their traditions were similar. Like the Mississippians, they added crushed clamshells to the clay when they made pots. Compare the design on the pot fragments to the pot found at Aztalan. Do you think it looks more like the Mississippian pot on page 51 or the woodland pot fragment on page 49? Communicating in many forms. How did early people communicate? How do you share ideas with people you know? Email, text message, talk on the phone? These are all forms of communication. Zoom calls. They don't have that in there. Not so long ago, most people mailed postcards and letters to friends and family who lived far away. Indian groups used many ways to communicate messages and share their history and traditions. Over 1,000 years ago in Wisconsin, some Native people used the sides of cliffs to leave messages for others. Other groups around Wisconsin carried load after load of dirt to create huge animal or spirit-shaped effigy mounds. The designs that potters carved into clay pots were another form of communication. The large and small things that early Wisconsin Indians created also communicated ideas about what they believed. People also communicated with one another in ways that we'd recognize today. They added designs to their clothes. They tattooed their bodies and changed their hairstyles. We are not always sure what they were trying to say, but we know that they were telling others something about themselves and the way they lived. Native people living in our state today still share their history and traditions through the things they create. Let's take a look at all of these pictures here. The top left, W.H. Canfield drew this picture of an effigy mound called Man Mound in Sauk County in 1859. You can see that Canfield took measurements of the mound and wrote them down. Man Mound is protected in a little park now, but as you can see from this recent photograph, the road cuts through the legs. To keep the original shape, the legs have been painted across the road and on the grass on the other side. Protecting effigy mounds preserves the past for future generations. From earliest times to the present, Indian groups used many ways to communicate messages and ideas about their history and traditions. This basket was made by 20th century Ho-Chunk artist Ruth Cloud Baraboo. You can see this bead cloth Ojibwe bag on the left and this woodland pot on the right. And my picture cuts off the rest of the caption there, but you can read that. A beautiful beaded cloth, wow. Where can you see rock art in Wisconsin? You can visit one of the largest sites for rock art at Roshikri State Park in Adams County. Long ago, Indians at Roshikri carved messages into the sandstone of the large cliff there. They also painted small figures on it. Other people who came later added their names and drawings, but you can still see the work done by early Indians. These Indians may have come to Roshikri on a spiritual journey. What were they trying to say? Perhaps their drawings and carvings told important stories or were used in ceremonies. Wisconsin is lucky to have effigy mounds and rock art from people that lived here thousands of years ago. By protecting these sites from damage, we preserve the story of Wisconsin. The bottom left, this rock art shows a pregnant deer. How can you tell the deer is pregnant? Go ahead and look at that. There's the big deer and there's a little deer inside of it. That's cool. This carving is a Roshikri State Park was made by Indians long ago. It is surrounded by carvings made by more recent people. Many places with rock art are protected so that visitors cannot ruin the old images. Changes over thousands of years. What have you learned about Wisconsin's early Indian groups? In this chapter, you've looked at the way the first people lived on land that later became Wisconsin. You've learned that Native people tell about their own past and stories and images. You've also seen how archaeologists use clues from artifacts and clues to learn about the past. The first people in Wisconsin slowly changed their way of living. The early Paleo people lived on the edge of glaciers. The climate was very cold. They hunted huge mammals like the woolly mammoth. The warming climate created different turning points in the way people lived. Archaic people had to adapt. They began using more plants and animal resources. By the end of the Archaic time period, more groups of people lived in Wisconsin. The Woodland, Mississippian, and Oneota were groups that lived in Wisconsin at about the same time. These groups lived somewhat differently from one another. Each group had its own style for making homes and pottery. Some groups relied more on farming crops like corn, beans, and squash. Others survived mainly by hunting and gathering. The animals they hunted and the weapons they used changed over time. In the next chapters, life seems to speed up. When non-Indians arrived in Wisconsin, they brought more changes. Wisconsin's Indian people had to adapt more rapidly. We continue to adapt to change today. What are the changes in tool technology tell you about the differences in the way people hunted, from the Paleo people to the Oneota people? This is kind of cool. Here's a list of places to visit that they talked about in this chapter. Ashland State Park in Jefferson, Chippewa Valley Museum, Geology Museum at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Kenosha Public Museum, Menominee Clan Story Display at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, Milwaukee Public Museum, Mississippi Valley Archaeology Center at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse, Wisconsin Historical Museum in Madison. So those would all be really cool family outings if you're looking for something to do that connects really well with our this chapter. The bottom here says, compare the houses from the Paleo rock shelter at top left to the Mississippian house at bottom right. What do we learn about the differences in the groups of early Indians in Wisconsin? And that is that. Thank you.